Have you ever kept a journal? And did anyone ever read it without your permission?
My parents always insisted that money was tight, that every dollar was stretched so thin it could snap, and I believed them because what choice did I have? I told myself I'd make it work, that I'd take extra shifts at the diner, save what I could, and maybe, just maybe, they'd pitch in when the tuition bills came. But when I asked about college, seriously asked, with a hopeful smile and my acceptance letters laid out on the kitchen table like a kid showing off straight A's, they shut me down with the kind of finality that leaves a sting in your chest. My mom leaned back in her chair, her hand waving like she was brushing away a fly, and said, "Sweetheart, we don't have that kind of money. Be realistic. College isn't for everyone." My dad sat there, eyes fixed on the newspaper as if the black and white print was more important than his daughter's future. I sat frozen, staring at them, wondering how they could just say it so casually, like my dream wasn't even worth considering. The words stung worse than I can describe, but I swallowed them down and nodded as though I'd understood, as though this was simply another reminder that I wasn't the golden child. I told myself not to cry, not to let them see how badly it hurt. And then, barely a week later, they invited me to a special dinner. My sister Emily was dressed to the nines, her nails freshly done, her smile wide enough to split her face. I thought maybe they had finally reconsidered. Maybe there was some miracle, some plan, some savings they had hidden away from me too. But when the champagne popped and my dad raised his glass with the most genuine smile I'd seen from him in years, it wasn't for me. It was for Emily. "We bought her a condo," Mom announced, her voice practically shaking with pride, like she had just announced a Nobel Prize or a wedding engagement. The word condo echoed in my ears as I sat stiff in my chair, my fork halfway to my mouth. My sister squealed, pulling out her phone to show pictures of the place, gleaming hardwood floors, big windows spilling light into pristine rooms, a shiny key dangling from her manicured fingers. Everyone toasted, everyone laughed, everyone congratulated her as if she'd won the lottery. I forced a smile, my face burning as I mumbled something polite, but inside I was cracking. They had money. They had enough money to buy her a condo. But for me, nothing but a lecture about being realistic. I barely tasted the food. My stomach turned with every laugh, every clink of glass, every reminder that I was invisible in my own family. Emily leaned over at one point, grinning like the cat that swallowed the canary, and whispered, "Guess I'm just the lucky one, huh?" My blood boiled, but I clenched my fists under the table until my nails dug into my palms. I wanted to scream, to throw the glass across the room, to call them all liars, but I stayed silent. Silence was my only shield. That night, when the house quieted and the dishes were stacked in the sink, I went upstairs to my room and pulled out the envelope I'd hidden in the drawer. The scholarship letter. Full tuition, full ride, for years covered. I'd been accepted weeks ago, but I hadn't told them yet. I wanted to believe they would be proud, that maybe they'd meet me halfway and help with living expenses, that I'd finally hear words like, "We believe in you." But now, with their champagne glasses still sticky in the sink and Emily's laughter echoing down the hallway, I knew I'd keep it to myself. I read the letter again, tracing the words with my fingers like they were sacred scripture. "We are pleased to offer you a full scholarship." That was my lifeline. That was the thing they couldn't take from me, no matter how much they ignored me or pretended I was second best. I folded it carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and tucked it under my mattress like a secret weapon. The days that followed were brutal. My parents fussed over Emily's condo as if it were a newborn child, shopping for furniture, buying throw pillows, arguing over paint colors. I tagged along once, sitting in the corner while Mom measured curtain rods and Emily twirled in the empty living room, declaring, "This is perfect for my lifestyle." Nobody asked me what I thought, and I didn't offer. It was better to be silent, better to let them underestimate me, better to let them think I had nothing going for me. Because the truth was, I had something they could never take credit for. At night, I filled out forms, checked lists, and made plans. I called financial aid offices during my lunch break at work, holding the phone against my shoulder while balancing plates of pancakes and coffee mugs. I didn't tell a soul. Every secret step I took felt like a brick in a wall I was building between me and them, a wall they wouldn't see until it was too late. I overheard Mom one evening bragging to her sister on the phone. "Emily's all set. A condo at her age, can you imagine? We've really done right by her." I bit my tongue so hard it bled. Done right by her. As if I hadn't spent years helping around the house, working shifts to pay for my own clothes, keeping my head down and my grades up without anyone cheering me on. But fine. If that was the story they wanted to tell, let them. I'd write my own, and I'd do it without them. The night before Emily moved into her shiny new condo, I packed a small suitcase and set it by the door of my room. It was worn, old, and barely zipped, but it held everything I needed. Just a few clothes, a stack of notebooks, and that letter that meant more than anything else. I stared at it for a long time, my heart pounding, knowing that once I walked out, things would never be the same. And as I lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling in the dark, I realized something. They thought they had shut a door on me, but really, they had just given me the push I needed to find another one. What they didn't know, what they couldn't even imagine, was that the next time they saw me, I wouldn't be the girl begging for help. I would be the woman who had built herself from nothing, and their shocked faces would be the sweetest revenge. The morning Emily picked up her keys, my parents floated around the kitchen like they were starring in a commercial for good parenting, the kind with copper mugs, expensive candles, and a soundtrack of meaningful sighs, and I stood there buttering toast I would not eat, folding it into a napkin like a prop, because the truth was I had already packed the small life I owned into a secondhand suitcase and slid my scholarship letter into the inside pocket where people usually keep passports and photographs of the ones they love, and while they rehearsed directions to the condo and debated whether the rug should be cream or ivory, I texted my manager at the diner to say this would be my last double shift for a while, which felt like stepping off a bus that had been rattling over the same cracked road for years. I asked Mom if she had any boxes she wasn't using, and she said, without looking up from the list of decorator stores, that Emily needed everything, which taught me more about supply and demand than any economics class could. I wiped the counter, slid my key off my chain, and pressed it into a white envelope with a note that said, as politely as I could manage, "Not your emergency anymore." Then left it on the hook by the door where we used to hang permission slips and dentist reminders, a tiny ceremony for a boundary they never believed I would draw. I rode the bus to campus with my suitcase banging my knee and a tote bag cutting into my shoulder, and while the driver announced stops in a voice that sounded like he had run out of faith in the power of vowels, I imagined arriving at a place where nobody knew me as the daughter who should lower her expectations, where my name wasn't a footnote to my sister's timeline, and I let that image carry me through the heat that stuck to the windows, through the neighborhood that always smelled like lawn chemicals and wet cardboard, through the moment when I almost texted my mother that I'd be out late and caught myself, realizing the habit of asking permission had outlived the relationship that required it. Orientation had already passed, but the scholarship office welcomed me with the kind of practical kindness that lands like cold water on a sunburn, not flowery, not performative. Just forms handed across a counter by a woman with smart shoes who explained the dining plan in sentences that stacked into a ladder I could actually climb, and when she said my tuition was fully covered and my stipend would hit my account by the end of the week, I nodded like a banker closing a loan, because I had learned at home that excitement gives people something to take. My room in the dorm was smaller than the bathroom in Emily's condo, a fact I recognized because she had posted a video tour with background music and captions about manifesting luxury. And yet I felt more spacious in that narrow rectangle than I ever had in our house, because every square foot was mine in a way I had never been to them. I folded my clothes into the built-in dresser, pinned the scholarship letter to the corkboard behind my desk like a private flag, and introduced myself to the girl across the hall who said she was pre-law and allergic to almost everything except coffee and trouble. I worked the campus library desk evenings and the dining hall breakfast shift on weekends, and in between I read until my eyes stung, filled notebooks with outlines, and learned to love the sound of the copier collating pages that had my name at the top. Not because the font was fancy or the topic glamorous, but because it proved I did not need a single thing from people who treated affection like a coupon that had already expired. I blocked my parents' numbers the same night I set my alarm for the first lab, and even though my thumb trembled before I pressed the button, I reminded myself that boundaries are not a press release you send out for applause. They're a quiet contract you sign with yourself, and you renew it every time the old story tries to stage a comeback. Mom tried to route herself around the block with emails from her work account, subject lines like important and quick question, but I let them collect in a folder labeled weather because that is what her outreach felt like to me now. Atmospheric noise that might ruin a picnic if I planned my day around it. Dad sent one message that read like a man who wanted to be better but was waiting for a woman to tell him how, and I closed the laptop and sat with the ache, because mercy for myself required refusing to do his homework for him. What hurt most, ironically, was not the silence from them, but the noise from Emily's videos, which sprouted like weeds across my feeds, each clip a little sermon about hustle and high thread counts. Each caption a performance of gratitude aimed squarely at my mother's pride. I learned to thumb past them the way you step around a puddle in a parking lot, not because you fear water, but because arriving with dry socks is a dignity you can grant yourself. On nights when hunger tried to auction off my resolve, I worked an extra hour at the help desk, showing freshmen how to unghost their printers and reset passwords their sleep-deprived brains had scrambled, and I banked the overtime in a savings account titled "Not Asking," a petty label that made me laugh, just enough to keep going when the vending machine ate my last dollar. The letter about my scholarship renewal arrived in late spring, a thick envelope that thunked onto the mailroom counter, and as I slid it open with a library card, I thought of the day in our kitchen when my mother brushed away my future like lint on a black dress. And it occurred to me that surviving is not the opposite of winning. Sometimes it is the method, the ankle-deep work you keep doing until the ground under your feet hardens into something you can sprint on. I took the letter to the campus quad where clusters of families picnicked under trees, called my favorite professor, and learned that he had already recommended me for a summer research spot that would pay enough to keep me from crawling back to the diner. At which point I laughed out loud, startling a toddler who glared at me like I had ruined his thesis, and then I pulled up my mobile carrier's app and removed myself from the family plan, no announcement, no lecture, just a clean cut, so that the next time my mother tried to call, she would hit the kind of dead air that teaches people their words are not currency everywhere. For dessert, because revenge does not always have to be heavy to be nourishing, I mailed the spare house key back in a padded envelope to the exact address of Emily's condo office, not her unit, with a neat little card tucked inside that read, "Lost and Found. Dependents," which the receptionist would inevitably log in that big ledger where umbrellas and dignity go to wait, and when my mother texted from an unknown number asking if I had seen the key because we might need you in an emergency, I set my phone face down, opened my laptop to the research proposal, and let the message slide into the silence it had earned, knowing that the next emergency would not be mine to solve and that, in a very specific and satisfying way, that was the point. By the time leaves began to bronze the sidewalks and the wind learned to slip under my coat with the persistence of a salesman, I had become someone who could hold 3 ideas in my head at once without dropping any of them, do the work in front of you, plan the work you want next, and never, under any circumstances, hand over the satisfaction of your progress to people who will turn it into a family anecdote where you play the lucky fool. So I stacked classes that made my brain hum with the hard kind of effort, kept the breakfast shift because something about the grease and the clatter gave a rhythm to the day, and took a tutoring job that taught me the quickest route to dignity is sometimes through another person's relief when a paragraph finally makes sense. I learned that success is quieter than people think, that it lives inside the calendar reminders and the grocery lists and the hours you do not spend explaining yourself to those who already decided what you are, and that if I saved the right emails and wrote the right replies, I could build a paper trail that outlasted the mood swings of anyone who believed generosity was a limited commodity to be issued with conditions and commentary. When winter flared and the campus steps turned into a skating rink nobody had asked for, I landed an internship in the registrar's office, which is not glamorous by any metric, but offers an education you cannot get in a lecture hall. Because the registrar is the backstage of the ceremony everyone pretends is all spotlight and violins. I learned how names move from a transcript to a program, how deadlines are not suggestions, but the bones that keep the whole thing standing, and how families who arrive late with demands and dramatic backstories are given polite smiles and pamphlets that do not change a single line of type. I did my work without gossip, returned calls with the kind of professionalism I had once begged for at the kitchen table, and tucked away a few practical details the way a mechanic tucks away the memory of which bolt goes first. There is a point in the spring when the list turns firm. There is a table the morning of commencement where someone always tries to perform a miracle, and there is a tone, firm but warm, that closes doors without slamming them. Knowledge, it turns out, is not just power. It is a backstage pass for revenge that looks like civility. Meanwhile, Emily's condo life continued to unspool in sunny clips where throw blankets did more heavy lifting than her job apparently required, and whenever one of those videos ambushed me between study notes and lab signups, I reminded myself that comparison is the cheapest poison on the shelf and that I had sworn off anything that could be bought with applause. On meaner days I muted her and wrote one more paragraph, because spite, when appropriately dosed, can be an honest fuel. I joined a first-generation student group where people told the truth without flinching, and, because I have always been a believer in receipts, I copied down the sentences that could carry me through a night when my resolve did not show up for work. Nobody is coming. So you might as well be the cavalry. Love that requires humiliation is not love. Elegance is ending the conversation without needing the last word. Spring brought the kind of light that makes even the library's old carpet look forgiving, and with it came a research grant that would pay me to ask better questions. A professor who wrote a recommendation so careful I felt seen right down to the bones. And a department award announced via an email I archived rather than forwarding to anyone, because the most radical act in a family like mine is refusing to use your success as evidence in a trial nobody is interested in conducting fairly. I celebrated by buying grapes not on sale and sitting on the quad with my friend from across the hall, who said in her usual dry way that the trick to being underestimated is doing something unforgettable while they are looking in the wrong direction. After which she showed me how to order a set of thank you cards that looked expensive, but were actually a printing error someone else's marketing department had decided to sell as limited edition. For my small offering to the gods of poetic justice, I mailed one of those cards to the high school counselor who had once suggested I apply to a cheaper program so your parents won't feel strained. And I wrote in tidy lines that I appreciated the advice yet found an alternative that did not require me to carry other people's fear like luggage, enclosing a photocopy of the scholarship renewal with my name blacked out except for the words "in good standing," which was petty in a way that warmed me like a cup of coffee nobody else paid for. It was not cruel, it was not public, and it did not demand a response. It was a quiet correction to a story that had never fit, and I felt a little taller dropping it in the mailbox, as though I had returned a library book that had been overdue since childhood. When the official message from the registrar pinged my inbox, I read it twice to steady the tide inside my chest. The list had closed, my degree had cleared, and the commencement program would print my full name as I had specified during that winter internship. Middle name included the way my grandmother said it when she meant business, while guest tickets would be available for pickup beginning on a date that landed exactly between the birthday my parents forgot 1 year and the anniversary of the Condo toast. I clicked the link to confirm pronunciation and resisted the almost physical urge to send the screenshot to anyone, because secrecy had become a muscle, and I had no interest in breaking it for sport. Then, because some forms of theater require the right props, I booked the plain black gown and the cap with a tassel that looked comically fragile next to the weight of the last 4 years. And I wrote a request to the dean's office in the same calm tone I used to explain deadlines to families in trouble, asking that if there were any awards to be announced on stage, they avoid notifying recipients beforehand, as the surprise would honor the spirit of the donors. The registrar's reply landed with a tidy affirmation and a blessing I did not ask for, and I stood up from my desk with the sense that a door somewhere had clicked. Not because someone finally decided to be generous, but because the lock had recognized a key I forged myself. I pulled on my jacket, walked past the table where I used to second-guess everything, and paused long enough to slide one sealed envelope into my bag. The one that held the extra guest tickets I did not plan to use, and as the elevator opened, I allowed myself the smallest smile at the thought that on the morning of commencement there would be a woman at a check-in table rehearsing her finest persuasive phrases, a man hovering behind her hoping the rules might, just this once, bend for charm, and a sister filming herself in the reflection of a glass door, while I, with my cap in one hand and the silence of 4 years in the other, would step out of the elevator and head straight for the stage, because the list, as I well knew, was already closed. Commencement week arrived with that strange blend of carnival and audit, a feeling that every balloon arch had to justify itself against a spreadsheet somewhere, and while the campus burst into photo ops and folding chairs, I moved through the preparations with the calm of someone who not only knew where the switches were but had learned who pretended not to see them. So I printed my confirmation, double-checked the gown rental, slid the phonetic spelling of my name into the little portal that tried to second-guess me, and walked past the registrar's office with a private salute to the people who keep chaos at a hum rather than a howl, because revenge, when you do it right, doesn't need fire, it needs procedure, it needs patience, and it needs an audience that does not realize it has bought tickets until the house lights dim. I bought a cheap pair of nude heels that looked like they would agree with me only for the length of the ceremony, and a lipstick that would read as resolve rather than invitation, and I tucked the extra guest tickets I had no intention of distributing into the inner pocket of my tote, because sometimes restraint is the show, not the dress, and because I wanted the weight of them against my ribs as a reminder that every absence is a choice as loud as a trumpet if you hold it still. On the morning of the rehearsal, the line of graduates curved along the walkway like a sentence that needed a semicolon, and as we practiced the choreography of relief, walk, nod, shake, pose, exit, I cataloged the small misfires that attend any event built by humans, the mic that cuts out and comes back with a cough, the anxious father who tries to slip past the rope to ask a volunteer whether his daughter's middle name can be corrected before the programs are printed, the mother with eyes already wet who says she only needs one extra ticket because her husband parked and will be right back, which we both understand means he is halfway to a meltdown in the men's room. I smiled at them the way a good usher smiles, kind without concession, because my anger had evolved past the sharp point of accusation into something disciplined and architectural, a structure you cannot see until you crash into it. Afterward, I walked the path guests would take from the parking lot to the check-in tent, past the banner with the founders' stern faces, past the commemorative oak that students draped with wraps in winter and lanterns in spring, past the spot where the families who arrive late start bargaining with the clock. And I imagined my mother there in her best jacket and her courtroom voice, rehearsing how to be the exception in a system I had already coded into muscle memory. I slept the night before commencement the way a person sleeps after a storm finally moves offshore, not deeply exactly, but with the relief that the rattling of the panes has stopped. And I woke before my alarm to a weather report that promised the kind of heat that wilts cheap flowers and ambition in equal measure. I braided my hair the way I did for lab, practical and neat, pressed the gown to flatten its worst creases, and ate a granola bar in the quiet, not because I was hungry but because the body demands offerings at ceremonies, and I had no intention of fainting at the hour I had built toward for 4 years. The first message arrived from an unfamiliar number at 8 in the morning, a cheerful "we're on our way, can't wait to see you shine," which read as a friendly neighbor until the second line landed, "Could you meet us at the tent and make sure your name is on the list?" Which is how I learned they had shifted from denial to hustle without passing through recognition. I put the phone face down, zipped my tote, and stepped into the hallway where other gowns whispered against other stairwells, a congregation of private histories making their way toward a public chapter, each of us carrying a version of the same quiet prayer that the name spoken into the microphone would sound like a door opening instead of a misprint. By the time I reached the quad, the air had turned into warmed glass, and the check-in tables were humming with that controlled chaos I understood too well. clipboards passing between hands, lanyards tangling, volunteers hydrating with the focus of marathoners. And it took exactly no skill to locate my mother, because she had assembled herself at the center of motion like a monarch butterfly with an agenda, layered pearls, tailored blazer, a smile calibrated for maximum photogenic warmth that could pivot into indignation before the shutter closed. Beside her, my father hovered with that practiced mixture of apology and deferral I had learned to read before I learned to read road signs. And Emily held her phone at a flattering angle that mirrored a version of a person who had come to support her sister while narrating her own generosity. I watched my mother lean over the table toward a young woman in a volunteer t-shirt and produce a sympathy-heavy voice I recognized from parent-teacher nights, a tone that suggests a tiny crisis shared between decent people who will surely solve it if policy could stop behaving so pig-headedly. And I saw the volunteer's shoulders straighten into the posture I had once coached into place myself, the one that says she has a script and an entire chain of command behind it. I could have intervened, could have made it easy, could have walked up and said my own name like a password that would lower the drawbridge and allow them to sweep in and claim a piece of my labor for their scrapbook. But the impulse faded as quickly as it rose, because a mercy that erases the lesson is not mercy at all. And because the story I was telling myself had always been about refusing to run ahead to clear obstacles they placed on the path and then held up as proof that I needed their help. So I slipped into the graduates line and let the check-in tent do exactly what it was designed to do, which is triage people who mistake urgency for entitlement, and I saved my breath for the stage. In the shaded gap between two buildings, I felt the vibration of another message from the same unfamiliar number, then another, each with escalating punctuation and variations on the theme of "they don't see your name." And for a moment I pictured my mother's fingers pecking at the screen, the way her mouth would purse when she encountered a boundary she did not authorize, the way she would turn to my father and assign him the role of bad cop while she tried to rescue the optics, and the image steadied me like a hand on the small of the back. When the marshal called us to order and the music lifted with that old, stubborn optimism, I tucked the phone deeper into the tote, aligned my cap so the tassel would not slap my cheek mid-aisle, and let the line carry me forward while somewhere to my right a volunteer explained for the third time that once the program is finalized the list cannot be amended without a time machine, which the institution does not currently possess. I stepped into sunlight that felt like a curtain, counted my steps because it calms me, and kept my eyes level as the first cluster of families erupted at the sight of their student, applause that always sounds like rain on a tin roof. And I understood in that moment that the revenge I had constructed was not a single blow, but a sequence of dignities, each one landing exactly where I had placed it. We curved around the end of the aisle toward the rows reserved for our division, and I lifted my chin just enough to see over the mortarboards ahead, not searching for my family, not avoiding them either, simply choosing the axis of my gaze the way you choose a lane on a highway you finally learn to merge into without flinching. The announcer began the roll for an earlier department and the names moved like a quiet tide, and as the marshals checked columns and the photographer adjusted his stance, I heard my phone vibrate one more time with the insistence of a wasp at a window, and I let it. Because the sound belonged to a past I had decided would not dictate the tempo of my present, I rested my hands on the program, traced the embossed crest with my thumb, and felt the delicious thrum of composure that comes when the plan has narrowed to its moment, and as the usher at the aisle put a hand out to hold our row until the last applause subsided, I lifted my eyes toward the stage where the dean leaned to the microphone with the measured warmth of someone who believes in ceremony not as theater, but as proof of labor, and I waited, steady and unsmiling, for the first syllable of my name to enter the air. The dean cleared his throat with the practiced softness of a man who has narrated more turning points than most parents ever witness. The microphone caught the consonants and held them like bright beads on a wire, and then my name, full, middle, and last, went out across the heat-shimmering quad with the hush and lift of a curtain, so that for a breathless instant I felt the years draw themselves into a single, taut line running from the diner's grease-slick floor to the registrar's back office, and onward to this wooden stage where the faculty row smelled faintly of starch and courage. I stood when the marshal's hand floated forward, gathered the skirt of the gown at my hip, and walked into the light with the slow, measured pace of someone who has finally remembered that there is no prize for sprinting when the timing is already on your side. The applause reached me first in pieces, the clap of a professor who once sent an email that made me cry in the good way, the sharp whistle of a classmate with whom I had shared library ghosts and vending machine triumphs, the controlled thud of the brass section jumping in a half-beat early, and I let it roll over me without breaking my face into that accommodating grin I used to wear at family dinners. Because this recognition belonged to the labor, not the optics, and I had no intention of packaging it for anyone else's memory book. When I took the parchment and turned for the photograph, I did not sweep the crowd for the people who had spent the morning trying to persuade a volunteer to conjure a miracle from thin air, yet I knew where they stood without looking. The way you know where an old injury will ache before the rain arrives. My mother would be at the tent's edge arranging her indignation into an anecdote about institutional coldness. My father would be studying the gravel as if an answer might be written therein. Pebble script, and Emily would be forcing a smile that concealed a bruise of confusion, because the plot they had rehearsed for 4 years did not include the scene. The daughter they had labeled impractical walking past their doubt as if it were just another rope line. The photographer called me by name with the casual reverence of a man who has learned that saying it correctly can repair a small universe, so I faced his lens and let the moment sit on my shoulders without flinching then. Pivoted as the marshal guided my row toward the ramp where the air cooled and the sound softened, and the smell of eucalyptus from the landscaping rose like a private benediction. I did not go to the check-in tent. I went to the small table in the shade where the donations liaison collected last-minute cards for the scholarship luncheon, placed the sealed envelope I had prepared into the tray, and watched the woman read the printed sticker that said, in a tidy serif, with gratitude from a recipient who learned that absence can be a kind of inheritance too. After which she looked up with that surprised kindness people reserve for notes that land harder than flowers, and she asked whether I would like to add a line for the program, but I told her the line I wanted had already been printed where it mattered, and that the rest would take care of itself. Then, because the show inside the show required one final cue, I walked along the back path to the tent's far corner where the breeze tugged at the vinyl walls, set my tote on the low fence, and took out the spare guest tickets I had carried like stones against my ribs, not to hand them over in a display of magnanimity that would let someone claim we had been included all along, but to slide them into the cardboard recycling bin with the quiet precision of a signature, so that some future event might be built on the absence of a fiction I declined to finance. They found me, of course, because indignation is a bloodhound and so is regret. My mother arrived first with her pearls slightly askew and her voice pitched into that frequency that reads as urgency if you have never heard it used to sell a half-truth. And she said we were going to miss my name unless we acted quickly, at which point I handed her my program open to the page where the letters marched in order and let her eyes stumble past the evidence to the reality it described. A choreography I had practiced with myself in mirrors for weeks. My father started to say he would talk to someone and I told him, as evenly as I could manage without letting the old ache colonize my lungs, that the talking had already been done, not in a tent or a kitchen or a showroom filled with throw pillows, but in every midnight email and every dawn shift and every small, unglamorous refusal to ask for permission from people who had turned permission into a leash. Emily, who had learned to make even confusion look photogenic, asked whether I wanted a picture together for the feed, which would have been funny if it were not so accurate, and I said I was headed to the luncheon where scholarship names were read in a room with bad carpet and excellent coffee, and that seats were for donors and mentors, not for families who remembered to be proud only after the ink dried. The cleverness of my revenge, if you can even call it that when all I did was stop handing over my narrative for editing, lived not in the sting of a one-liner or the theater of a walkout, but in the structure of the day I had engineered so the only path to proximity ran through rules they did not write and patience they did not possess. Still, because I am not made of stone and because the child who wanted someone to clap does not die so much as learn new manners, I let my mother press the program to her chest and compose herself for a speech about starting fresh, a speech I could have written in my sleep, and I told her that fresh starts are gardens, not erasers. that they require tools and time and a willingness to get on your knees in the dirt without shouting at the soil for being stubborn. She asked what that meant for us, and I said it meant I would walk to the luncheon, and then to the ceremony's second half, and then to a small party in a courtyard where my friends would toast with plastic flutes, and after that I would go home to a room that fit me because I had built the walls to my measurements, and if she wanted anything else, she could show me not with speeches, but with seasons. I left them there under the banner that promised futures with a font too cheery for the humidity, and as I stepped back into the light the band struck up a march I could not name, and the air lifted just enough to move the flags. And I thought about the key I had mailed months ago and the envelopes I had sealed and the many times I had chosen to let silence do the heavy lifting, and I realized that forgiveness, if it ever came, would not be a grand unveiling on a stage, but a series of small concessions to hope made in rooms with no audience, and that I was allowed to keep my distance until those rooms existed. When the dean returned to the microphone to announce an award sponsored by alumni who preferred to remain unnamed, I took my seat with the assurance of a person who knows the list is closed, the photograph already taken, the script tucked into a drawer only I can open, and as laughter rolled across the chairs from some joke I missed, I looked down at the creased program, at the line of type that had been the target of so much bargaining, and I folded it once, then again, then slid it into my tote with the deliberate care of someone who recognizes that the ending they have chosen may never be the ending anyone else would write, which is, in a way that still surprises me, exactly the point.